Hello, everybody. This is Jason Harris with the National Health Council. Just wanted to thank you for joining and give a quick few reminders before I turn it over to Eleanor Perfetto for the start of this webinar series. Just as a reminder, please utilize the chat feature. If you want to ask any questions or feedback, please feel free to utilize that throughout, and we will compile everything at the end and go through a short Q&A session. And with that, I will kick it over to Eleanor.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third part of our webinar series, Patient Engagement and Value Assessment. We understand that if you're in the Washington, D.C. area, Comcast is having some internet outages, and so some of you may be trying to join and you're listening in by the call-in number, but you might not be able to access the webinar because of that internet outage. So we apologize for that. It's not us. It's apparently Comcast. And we are recording this session, so if it becomes difficult for you to follow, you know that you can always listen to the recording after this is over. And hopefully not too many of you are being inconvenienced by that. So we'll go to our next slide. And what we're looking at part 3 today. We have covered in part 1 in September an introduction to value frameworks, an overview of them. In part 2, we did an introduction to health economics and value assessment, and that was really focusing on terminology and what are the different things that are going on in this area that you might need to learn so that you know the lingo and would be able to become very engaged and feel knowledgeable. And now today we're talking about how the patient community can and should be engaged in this process, and we want to give you some ideas of what you'll be able to do and how you can become more involved and some tools and resources that you'd be able to use. So today we're going to be talking about the impact to date, what's been going on, where patients have been engaged and what's been happening there. We're going to talk about tools to support your activation. So there are some steps to activation. We put those in our Get Ready checklist. That is a tool that is available on our website. And we're going to basically walk through what the steps are in that Get Ready checklist. We're going to talk about our rubric, the improving the patient centricity of value assessment, but through use of another tool, and that's the rubric that we have. And we're going to walk through some of that so that you'll know a little bit more about it, and then you can read the entire document or use the entire document as you need to. And then we're going to have a case example that we're going to talk through. So let's begin with some impact to date. As you know, there are a number of value frameworks that exist. They're being used by different stakeholders, and we've walked through this through our first 2 programs that we had as part of this webinar series. We talked through who those value framework developers are and what's going on there so that you could familiarize yourself with them. But you know, it's good to know that the value frameworks are evolving and that they are changing as they are getting input from different stakeholders. And one of the things that we have contributed to and other members of the patient advocacy community have contributed to is educating those value framework developers on the role that the patient community has in this discussion and helping them understand the importance of hearing the patient community's voice. And as they've done that, and as we've done a lot of work in this area, we have seen changes happening to those value frameworks and to really do a better job of incorporating the patient voice. And so while there is still work to be done, we know that this is an evolving process. And one of the things that you need to be aware of is keeping your finger on how it is evolving and what's going on in the field. And originally, patients didn't have very much voice, but that is different now, and we have seen the change. Let's take a look at the landscape for value assessment. One of the projects that the National Health Council worked on in the last year was to look at who are the different players globally in what's happening here. And you will see that there are some national and regional health technology assessment groups that have been doing this work over a number of years. There are professional organizations, professional associations, and we've talked about a number of those in our previous sessions where we talked about what's been happening with groups like ASCO, the American Society of Clinical Oncology, and the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, and some of these organizations that have put out the frameworks that we've been taking a look at and talking about. But there are others that you might not be as familiar with, and under the collaborations or independent organizations, you see ICER, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. you see that there are many different types of organizations that have been doing this kind of work over a large number of years. And so if you take a look at them, we wanted to ask the question, how engaged have patients been in this process, and how actively have they been engaged, and how has that been changing? And so we actually did an assessment. We looked at their websites. We sent them some questionnaires to ask them about this, and we looked at three things. We said, what are the terms that they are using to describe engagement? How are they phrasing that? What are they looking for? What are they putting on their website? What are the opportunities, the how and when patients can be engaged with those organizations? And we also looked at, is there evidence of patient engagement in some of the things that they've put out recently? And we just want to give you a little snapshot of what we learned in going through this process. The first thing that we learned, and this is a busy slide, but I'll walk you through it. If you think about those three things that we were looking for, first we looked at what are the terms, and look at the wide array of terms that they're using. Patient input, public consultation, lay involvement, open input. You'll see it's a pretty wide variety of the different kinds of terms that are being used. And so with that regard, that can cause a lot of confusion in the field. And so if you are planning on monitoring some of this for your organization or thinking about how you might get involved in this, it's good to be aware of the different range of terms that get used when you're looking at something like this, and that these groups are putting out there on their websites. Number two, what are the different kinds of opportunities that are out there for patient engagement across these bodies? Well, if you take a look at this, you'll see some of them put out patient questionnaires. You can see there were 2 that reported on that. Many of them had open comment periods. Again, a couple of them that reported on that. There were a number that had participation on committees, where they looked for individuals' nominations to become members of these committees. And so there were 6 of those that looked at something like that. Ability to propose topics. That was listed on one of the websites as an engagement opportunity. Help drafting the guidance. Again, that was listed in one instance. And then a general what was called a stakeholder forum, where patient groups could participate and patients could participate. And again, 1. So you can see, again, a range of opportunities. They're phrased in different ways, but also many of these organizations probably have similar kinds of opportunities. They just weren't listed on their website quite as clearly, and so we weren't able to abstract those. And then lastly, what is the impact of evidence? How do we know when we look at a report that there was patient engagement in putting that report together? And while many of the organizations describe engagement opportunities in their documentation that they make available publicly, really only 2 that we looked at actually had clear evidence of engagement having an impact on decision-making or being clearly incorporated into a report that they made publicly available. So while we are still learning more and these organizations are evolving, we can tell you we did this work a little over a year ago, and we know this landscape has already changed, and we are in the process of updating the work that we've done in this area so that we can stay abreast of what's happening and learning more about what these organizations are putting on their websites, and especially when it comes to those opportunities for engagement, so that we can make sure that people know about it and understand about it from our own community. I want to begin by discussing the tools. And the first tool that I want to talk about is the Get Ready checklist. As I said, this is a document that's available on our website, and I encourage you to download it and take a look at it. I'm going to go through it at a very high level. I'm not going to delve too deeply into it, and I'm certainly not going to read this document to you. But just know that it's a step-by-step guide for patients' organizations to help them get ready to engage with a value framework developer and the kinds of things that you need to know in order to be prepared. There are actually 6 steps that we have to this process, and I'm going to give you just some examples of what some of this looks like. So there's actually like 6 chapters that are in here. The first is advanced preparation, what you need to do in advance of any kind of engagement. The decision whether or not to engage, how you consider coalitions and partnerships in order to extend your reach, refining your strategy for engagement, and then actually some tips on how you actually engage with these framework developers, and then the things that we suggest you do to follow through. So let's give you just a few examples of what we're talking about in each of these categories. So in step 1, advanced preparation. These are the different aspects that we talk about under advanced preparation. You're going to have to do some searching. Who are the groups out there, whether they're professional organizations or independent organizations or health technology assessment bodies, who is working in your area of interest? Who has zeroed in on your disease area or a treatment for your disease area, and they intend to begin some work in this area? You'll have to look at various websites and things out there to really learn who has that interest. Assessment. Understand the process of those organizations that are working in your area of interest. How do they work? Who do they work with? What opportunities might there be? Learn. Familiar yourself with their website, with their materials, and look at some of the past work that they've done, past value-related work. What are the reports that they've put out that can give you some insight about the direction that they would go in or how they work? Investigate. Many of these organizations work on a timeline that's related to the review of products that are looking for FDA approval. And so if you have a sense that there is a product in your disease area that is in review or is expected to be submitted sometime soon, or that there's more than one product in review, you might take a look at the timeline for when that review is taking place and when you think that there would be an approval, because generally it's that timeline that coincides with when an assessment might be developed and when an assessment might be released. That can give you some insights about the kind of timeline you have to work with in order to be able to become engaged in the process, because those value framework developers might be using a similar timeline for their work. And then alignment. Does the developer's work align with the National Health Council Value Model Rubric? And we're going to talk about some details about that rubric in a few minutes. Critical decision, deciding whether or not you want to engage. So one of the things that we talk about in this section of the checklist is that this is an important decision that your organization needs to make, because engaging means that there will be time and resources that will be put into this engagement activity, and some of those can be quite intense, and your organization has to really be ready to jump in and do the work that needs to be done, but everyone needs to understand how much work that might be and what your organization's appetite is for taking on this kind of a role. So articulate, make sure that everyone involved understands what those issues are and what it might mean to your organization, and then evaluate what is your organization's appetite for engagement. An example from step 3, consider coalitions and partnerships. We know that we usually have more strength in numbers, and if you don't have enough resources, you can also work with other organizations, and that way you can become more efficient and be able to share resources to get this done. So under step 3, we recognize you think about mobilizing, bring together relevant organizations and stakeholders that you might be able to work with on a particular value topic, and that way you might be able to tackle an issue or become more engaged than you might have the capacity for just within your organization alone. Step 4, refining your strategy. So your strategy is best substantiated with data and facts. Therefore, you're going to want to take some time to assemble the information that you have internally, assemble information that you've been gathering or that your scientific advisory committee might be able to contribute. Gathering information from your community is a key asset for you in this instance. It gives you more strength to be able to go to one of these model developers or one of these framework developers and say, hey, wait a minute, I have collected data from my patient community, and it would be beneficial for you to consider that data in the work that you're doing. It gives you a leg up, and it's certainly an asset that they would be looking for. Search. Fill gaps in the data where you're able, especially gaps that framework developer does not have. State your intentions clearly. What is your strategy? What are you trying to do? continuously think about reevaluation, because as you gather more information, it might change your strategy. Have your messaging ready to deliver. And one thing that patient groups might not expect is that there might be negativity when you're going to approach a value framework developer. There might be some negativity toward patient groups. Some organizations believe that patient groups have been bought by the pharmaceutical industry, and that the only reason why they have an opinion about any of this is because someone bought their opinion. Or they may have an attitude that patient groups are too vested in this disease, they're too emotional. And it's part of our role to show that, no, we know what we're talking about, we're skilled, we have the capacity to engage on these things, and we have information, data, and the voice of the patient to represent. In engaging with developers, have a game plan mapped out on how you will approach them. Be sure you have your objectives ready for each conversation. What do you really want to accomplish? And then in your communication with developers, who are you going to be communicating with them? How best to communicate with them? When during this process will you communicate? Map that all out so that you have a game plan. You may not always be able to stick with it, but it's best to think through at what point do you want to contact them, and what do you want to contact them about, and be very strategic about that. And then lastly, there's that follow-through. Demonstrate that you're committed, that you're not going to just go away because they might have said no, that they didn't have an interest in talking to you at the beginning. Be persistent and demonstrate that you are really committed to this. Be visible. Use every opportunity to be viewed as an important stakeholder. So be out there and be talking about these issues so that it's recognized that you are a leader. Communicate to keep your constituents informed as well as other stakeholders, and then commit for the long haul. If you're going to be there, stick with it and demonstrate that follow-through.
Just going to take a moment here to pause, and if anyone has any questions related to the checklist, please just going to take about 30 seconds and give Eleanor a quick break in speaking. So please type those in if you have any.
And as I said, this document is available on our website. Please feel free to download it and take a look at it, and when you have a lot more time to digest the information that's in there. And it really is intended as a guide to help organizations be prepared to engage with framework developers.
All right, thank you.
The next tool that we have available that we'd like to introduce you to is the Patient Voice and Value, and it's the rubric that we've put together. It's a guide for framework developers on meaningful incorporation of patient engagement, and it also helps patients and patient advocacy groups evaluate how patient-centered a framework that becomes available, how patient-centered it is. It's a tool to help kind of rate that organization on how good a job you think that they've done. Again, available on our website if anyone wants to look at it in more detail. And I'm going to walk through at a high level. So if you think about this process that these framework developers go through, they do some planning, they draft it, and then they refine it, usually with input from a variety of stakeholders. They disseminate it, and then many organizations out there will implement the information. Pardon me. And then there's an evaluation process of that framework and the report that comes out of it, and then there's some update and maintenance to that. We think that there are 6 key opportunities for patient-centeredness and patient engagement to happen, and that's in partnerships, in transparency to patients, in the inclusiveness of patients, in being sure that there's diversity of patients and populations, in the outcomes that patients care about, and in using patient-centered data sources. Pardon me, I've got a little tickle going on. So I'm not going to go through all of the rubric. It's a fairly lengthy document, but I am going to introduce you to some of the concepts and the way that the document is set up. So in terms of patient partnerships, one of the premises is that patients should be involved in every step of the development and dissemination process. That's a basic foundational element. Well, we want to also talk a little bit about what does that look like? How would you recognize that that's happening in a particular value framework or has happened as represented by an assessment that's been done, a completed report? Well, the characteristic that you would look for is that direct input is collected from a wide range of patients, as is suited to the disease, population, and context of the report that's being prepared. So high engagement might look for examples like a patient survey was conducted, interviews of disease-specific patient advocacy group staff took place, and or the use of a disease-specific registry took place in that development. What low engagement would look like is that the report or the assessment only included the use of data from randomized controlled trials, and that they reported only clinical outcomes. So concentrating on that characteristic, these are simply examples. We're not saying that everyone should do this or that it should always look this way. These are just examples of what we mean by what good engagement would look like versus poorer engagement on that particular characteristic. Another consideration is that there's rationale to substantiate the adequacy of the ratio of patients to non-patient participants provided. So what does that mean? How would that be evidenced in a report or through an activity that you might read about on a website? Let's say that there's a 10-member advisory committee and that 2 members were patients and 1 member is a family caregiver, and that the rationale is provided for the stakeholder composition of that committee. You understand why they thought it was important to have 2 patient members and 1 family caregiver member, and that approximately 30% of the committee would be made up of patients and family caregivers. And you can make a judgment about whether or not you think the rationale is clear and whether or not the rationale is sound. And a low patient-centeredness in terms of how this was presented, perhaps they have an advisory committee, but there are no patients that are serving on that advisory committee, and no rationale is provided for what the stakeholder composition is. So these are examples that we provide as part of the rubric to help people make an assessment of whether or not they think a patient-centered approach was taken to a value framework or to an assessment report that's been published. So let's talk a little bit about the utility of the rubric. It's intended to assist all stakeholders and to support the developers in conceptualizing their plans for meaningfully engaging patients. We know that many of them are doing a much better job of engaging patients, and we really hope that the rubric is serving as a guide for them, and we believe that it is. It really should help them with understanding what good practices look like. And from our perspective, it's a living document that we want to refine over time as more and more framework developers become more patient-centered. We want to learn from their experiences. We want the patient groups to learn from these experiences, and we want to get feedback from all the stakeholders so that we can make this a more and more important document and one that is more and more sound as we gather more information. So I think you might ask, how does my organization engage in this process? And so I think we certainly encourage use of the tools because we think that that's an important way to go. But we wanted to provide you with a case example where we actually walk through what does involvement and engagement actually look like, and how did that come about, and what is the work that an organization has had to do behind the scenes in order to become best prepared and really become activated.
Yeah, and so with that, we want to introduce a couple guest speakers that we have on the line. And Leslie and Barry, I'm going to unmute you now. And so from our the National Multiple Sclerosis Society, we have 2 folks on the line, Barry Talent and Leslie Ritter. Barry is the Executive Vice President in Advocacy, and Leslie is the Senior Director for Federal Government Relations. And they have vast experience, actually just went through a value assessment review process. So I will kick it over to Barry and Leslie, and I also have the case example for you guys to walk through, among other things.
All right, thanks, Jason. I think Barry, this is Leslie. I am Senior Director of Federal Government Relations. Barry will be joining us in a few minutes, but what I wanted to do is go ahead and kind of talk about our involvement in the process. So as Jason referenced last summer, I served the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, undertook a review of treatments for multiple sclerosis. So this process for us really kicked off around July 1st of last summer. and culminated, as you can see on the slide, in a report that was issued in March. So this was a pretty long-term commitment for us to be involved with. And I was going to kind of walk through our process by using the Get Ready checklist as a guide. So in terms of advanced preparation, as Eleanor noted, a lot of times these framework developers usually time their reviews around the approval of a new product coming to market, and that is something that we did see. We had ocrelizumab that at the time was pending FDA approval, and so the timing of the review was very, very close to that. Now, we had a little bit of a delay because the FDA delayed its approval decision for ocrelizumab by a few weeks, but that gave us kind of an advance notice of the process, so we were able to kind of look at that. When we were deciding whether or not to engage, and I think Leah from the National Psoriasis Foundation talked about this too, this is a long-term commitment. Like I said, it ran from July until March. So it did take a lot of staff time, and not just internal staff time. We sought advice and counsel from other advocacy groups, from some of our advisory committees, both healthcare providers and people living with MS, so offering different perspectives. So it was not just our time that we had to balance, but we had to balance theirs as well. But we did think that this was a process that we needed as much information and to be able to articulate our point of view to ICER. I think it was really important, and I think Eleanor called this out, to really look at what your organization or your partners can bring to ICER that they don't have experience with. And in our case, ICER's staff and their expertise is based in economic analysis. They were not disease experts in multiple sclerosis, so that was an area where we stepped up, and other groups stepped up and kind of imparted some of our experiences and information to them. And we saw that the communication channels, they really appreciated that perspective. We saw with the original scoping documents that ICER put out, it really only looked at relapsing remitting and treatments for relapsing remitting MS. And through information not from just us and our partners, but from all stakeholders, they revised that initial scoping document to look at treatments for primary progressive MS as well. And it was important to note, too, that we realized when we were engaging with them that these were high-cost therapies, and so it was even more important that they actually had a good representation on how these therapies impacted the people taking them and the people prescribing them. And so in kind of moving on through the checklist, that's when we really tried to organize ourselves and our partners. We worked closely with the MS Coalition. We're a member of the coalition, and we worked to make sure that we could bring the patient voice directly to ICER. And as you can see on the slide, we created an online questionnaire to assess patient perspectives on what was most important to them when they were making decisions about which therapies to take. And we were able to give that to ICER and really be able to verify not only the patient perspective in narrative form, but also give them a questionnaire so that they could refer to that themselves. One thing I think that it's challenging because when your organization is undergoing one of these reviews, all stakeholders are commenting. There is a public comment period. So one thing to really kind of keep top of mind is that, you know, make sure that your partnerships are in conversations are based on mutually agreed upon issues. Because sometimes the patient groups can come with different perspective, and it's really good to just kind of outline what's most important to that review. And, you know, patient groups are not the only ones commenting on these in these comment periods. We have had, you know, we did engage with conversations with industry partners around the review, because in certain circumstances they have very, very valuable information. However, we made the decision not to submit joint comments with industry or share our comments until they were submitted through the public process, just because we know that those kinds of negative associations are out there. And frankly, our job was not to make the case for those people. It was to make the case for people living with MS and their perspectives on what was most important, particularly around this nebulous concept of value. In terms of refining the strategy, what was really helpful for us was trying to determine what questions that we wanted ICER to address. We knew, as I said, that these were high-cost therapies and that, this was going to be, somewhat different of a process. But what was most meaningful to the people living with MS? Was it the final product of something being deemed valuable or not valuable, or was it broadening the conversation to what matters most to the people taking these therapies? One thing that helped us is that ICER is very transparent with the public comments that they receive. So every time a group submits a public comment, you can actually go onto ICER's website underneath the materials for that area and actually read responses to the comments. And that was really helpful because, as Eleanor pointed out, it's not just engaging once on a public comment, it's engaging over and over again. And so it was really helpful in terms of determining your strategy and refining the strategy to go in and see directly what ICER's response was to some of the things that we flagged as either challenging or problematic in the review. And that way you can refine your strategy based on their answers. So in terms of, moving through the checklist, engage with the developers. Like I said, we commented at every opportunity for public comment, but we also had ongoing informal discussions. If there was a point of clarification or if they had questions, we were available to answer them and really presented ourselves as a resource for their staff. And also, in going to the public meetings, our meeting was part of the California task force that was looking at this. So, it did involve some travel, but having that public comment and having all of your partners be there and rehearing or having the message come not from you, but being reinforced by your partners was very, very critical. And also in terms of follow through, we saw pretty good engagement with ICER throughout the process. Like I said, they changed the original scoping document, revised that. We also saw at the public meeting questions and the patient perspective being included in the narrative of the report at that meeting that was released in March. It was a pretty quick turnaround. Our public meeting was in February and the report was released in March. So having the patient perspective included in the narrative portion of that report was a really good first step. And also the California Technology Assessment Forum, who actually held our public meeting, cited that the patient considerations were top of mind when they voted on the questions about ICER's review of the therapy. So, it is a back and forth process. It is a long-term commitment, but we thought that we came out of it on the other end more fit to kind of look at this concept of value and really being able to influence the committee members and the staff members of ICER of how important that patient perspective was as they undertake these kind of reviews.
Thank you. Just want to check to see if Barry was able to join us. Is she on yet?
I'm here.
Barry, anything that we could ask you that you might want to add?
No, I think Leslie did a nice job of covering it all.
I have a question for you. I have a couple questions for you, actually. If you given what you experienced in doing this, given what you learned, what do you think you might have done, you would have liked to have done differently in terms of getting ready, in terms of getting prepared? You know, it's kind of like knowing what you know now, what would you have done differently, or what would you like to have had the opportunity to do differently or to help you get better prepared? Anything come to mind there?
Well, I think we would have tried to engage some more people directly living with MS. You know, one of the challenges is that things are written at a fairly high scientific level, and so it was difficult for sort of the average person living with MS to understand a lot of what the ICER documents were. And so in the end, we did not have anyone living with MS who spoke at the California committee meeting. I also think we were the first time that ICER agreed to do a large-scale survey of people impacted by the disease to understand their perspectives, and so that the turnaround time for developing the survey and then putting it out there and trying to analyze the data was extremely quick and sort of way too accelerated for what we were trying to do there. I think those are a couple of the things.
Great. We have some other questions that have come in from the chat. So, Jason, I'm going to let you jump in and read some of those.
Yeah, thank you. And one of them really revolved around the idea of partnerships. So if you guys could just go into a little bit more detail about, you know, how your coalition was formed with some of your colleagues in the MS space, and just sort of what went into that and the thinking behind it.
Yeah, so this is Barry. So the MS Coalition is an existing group, so it didn't form specifically around ICER, but it's existed for a number of years, and it's different groups that work to improve the quality of life for people with MS. You know, that being said, I know the American Academy of Neurology talked to ICER a number of times, and of course all of the pharmaceutical companies with MS products. We're in many conversations with ICER and submitted public comments at the meeting. So there's others within the space. You know, we happen to have an existing coalition group, and we both worked with that group and submitted comments separately as a National MS Society. So part of that was because we, as the MS Society, already had existing statements around the prices of medications that we wanted to include in our comments, but I also think that it was important to generate both quality and quantity of comments that were getting the same points across. So it worked out well that the MS Coalition submitted comments and we helped the coalition group draft it, but then the MS Society was submitting individual comments as well.
So Barry, another question. Could you talk a little bit in terms of, and you touched upon this when you were talking about the survey, could you talk a little bit about the kinds of resources that go into something like this? And I think that includes, you know, it may be the cost to do a survey, whether you did it internally or whether you had to hire a consultant to do that for you, or the cost in terms of personnel time, because that also can be a significant resource that goes into something like this. Can you talk a little bit about the resources that you had to put into something like this, because I think it's important for people to really understand that this can be something that that does demand time and money.
Sure. So we did not use any extra monetary resources for the survey. We were able to do that through the MS Coalition, the coalition partners that we worked with. And we're happy to share the survey questions that we used with any organization. ICER in particular was interested in sort of one set of questions and data point around what people with MS were considering or thinking about when they chose which medication to be on. And so it's that particular table of information that is included in the written report. So sort of anyone can look and see it there. So I think it's important to have that back and forth with ICER around what specific information they're looking for. They don't have the resources, either money or time, to do this kind of survey, so it is sort of on the patient groups and others to take that on. So we did not spend extra money. We did have some health research scientists that were able to help us draft the survey who work across our organizations, and then we put it out there by just doing it sort of electronically on all of the group's websites, pushing out through emails to various constituencies, and we had about 16,000 responses to the survey.
Just a reminder, if anyone has any questions, please send them into the chat function. We're happy to read your questions. Barry, I have another question for you, and it's on, could you characterize the outreach that you had to a group like ICER? I know early on some of the patient groups had a negative experience because they felt like ICER was telling them that they didn't really want to hear from them. And it's our understanding that has changed over time. So could you kind of describe what your experience was, and did it change over time?
Sure. I don't think it was a negative experience at all. We didn't get that feeling from ICER that they weren't interested in the patient groups. I think they were, when we were going through it, they were kind of new to engagement at that level with a lot of different organizations. So we were sort of reaching out to each other at the same time, and were able to connect and set up a few meetings. I think what struck me most that Leslie touched on was that there's not a depth of understanding of the disease space at all. So I think being prepared to answer some very basic questions and provide very basic information about the disease space is really important in some of those initial conversations. And we had several meetings with different people at ICER, and some of that included suggesting other people or other organizations that they spoke with. We gave them names of other organizations and contact information. We gave them names of a few MS neurologists who we had checked with first, and they had agreed to speak with ICER. I think we had offered since the very first conversation with ICER to help them gather large-scale patient information, whether through focus groups or a survey, and that kind of took them a while to sort of get into and agree to do it. But I think they've done it a few times since then, and now sort of understand the value of that kind of information.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Barry, can you also, or Leslie, either one of you, could you also kind of paint a picture of the CTAF meeting and what happens in those meetings and what the role is of patients, and just kind of that, how do you have to be prepared to be able to go into one of those meetings? I think not just in terms of the content piece, because we would expect that you'd have to be prepared with content, but just kind of logistically and in terms of what to expect, expectations in being prepared for one of those kinds of meetings.
Sure. So I went to the meeting that we had in California, as Leslie mentioned, and so the committee members are sitting around kind of a hollow square, and there's presentations first around the report and the information in the report. And there were two sets of public comment periods. So one set of public comments was from the pharmaceutical manufacturers in the space. They typically have limited that to, I think, 5. In MS, we have more than 5 companies, and so they did it a little differently and had a representative from every company come up and sit at the table, and they just kind of went down the line. Comments are supposed to be limited to 5 minutes, and they were pretty strict about cutting it off at that 5-minute mark. And then the second set of public comment period is for patient groups or anyone else who wants to speak. So the MS Society spoke, the MS Coalition spoke, 1 or 2 neurologists spoke, and that would be the place where individuals living with the disease would speak. I think for that in particular, it's important to note that you have to register to do that a fair amount of time in advance. And it's easy enough to do. It's through the ICER website, but you do have to do that ahead of time. And again, your comments are limited to 5 minutes, and so it was, we went through a couple of sort of revisions of comments and practicing reading them out loud to make sure that we were coming within that. And most of the groups who spoke really spoke around the importance of the patient perspective. We included 1 or 2 sort of case studies from people with MS in our comments to really provide that patient voice, and really talked about how, in particular in the MS space, there's a lot of therapies and the disease is very heterogeneous, and so you need sort of all of these options for people. And when it got to the committee discussion point, they were a little surprised that sort of all of the comments had been so vehement on those points, and they felt like it was sort of critical of them as a committee and of the process. But I do think that it was helpful for them to really be keeping those comments and sort of the patient perspective in mind as they actually went through the voting process. So they have opportunities to ask questions at the MS meeting. There was sort of a side panel of experts or people there to offer a policy perspective, and that included myself, a person with MS, and 2 MS neurologists. And so at any point, someone from the panel could ask a question. Generally, it would be directed at one of the neurologists, and they would provide a response. And after the committee voted on the questions that ICER presented to them, the afternoon moved into a policy roundtable where we participated a little bit more in that, and that was a little bit more on the policy recommendations that the ICER report came out with, which included things like, thinking carefully around the value of step therapy in the space, needing more research on sort of value outcomes and things like that.
So Barry, I think this is going to be my last question for you and Leslie. We don't have any other questions that have come in through the chat function, and the last is one from me, and it's what advice do you have just in general that's beyond any of the things that we've asked you to talk about in your experience, or anything that might be in the checklist or in the value rubric, anything we haven't covered that you would say, boy, you really need to know this before you take this on, or you really need to know this before you walk into that room? Anything that you can think of that we didn't touch upon in some of these materials that, is kind of a new insight that we maybe should be incorporating into our materials as we think about updating them?
That's a great question, Eleanor. I think what we had some conversations with ICER about after was just sort of, they're coming from a place where they're trying to understand the value that the products bring and make recommendations on that. But their process for doing that is really based on clinical trial data. And while they included the table of information I talked about, that was, the people with MS sort of talking about what they think about when they take their medication, they don't yet have a system or a methodology for really incorporating that type of information into their assessment. So it's included in the narrative, but not necessarily in their outcomes as they look at the information. And so I think all of us sort of as a community, for people who take these medications, for healthcare providers, for ICER and others that are doing these reviews, need to constantly think about how these value assessments can be evolved to really make sure that we're capturing all of the relevant information that all of the stakeholders need.
Thank you. I really want to thank you and Leslie for being available today to help with this educational program. And today is our last of the 3-part series, and so one of the things that we'll ask everyone to do is please remember to complete our evaluation form. We really encourage you to do that. And if you participated in any of the previous sessions, Session 1 or Session 2, and you want to complete the evaluation form for those also, we encourage you to do that. We're still collecting information on those actively. We look for your suggestions and recommendations, so please remember to do that. We strongly encourage completion of our evaluation forms, and we really want to thank you all for being part of our 3-part series. Any feedback that you'd like to provide, you can do it through the evaluation form, or feel free to send us an email message. You can send it to Rachel Stivers, who many of you have registered with or have been sending information to, or you can also send it to our National Health Council info@nationalhealthcouncil.org. Thanks again. We really appreciate your participation, and we look forward to hearing from you.
That's it. Thank you, everyone.